I remember it was like an ordinary day at St. Anthony, and I was in the staff room, and my principal, Karen, came to me and said, Jason, I want to talk to you about a new project that I'm starting. And um, I remember her saying to me, I'd like you to start this knowledge building. And I guess my first part of the journey was that we talked about it, and um, we drove together to the symposium in October, and I took part of that process, and it was very interesting. And I remember I call it the drive home part. And driving home, we were talking about it, and she said to me, Jason, do you think you can do this? And I remember saying to her, I don't know how, Karen, I'm going to do this. I don't know how you want me to change my teaching practice. And I was really fearful of, taking on something new in my classroom. But I look back, and that was the beginning, and she planted the seed in something that has evolved over time. And I'm really excited about where this journey has taken me. I think back to, how I started in the classroom, and, I looked at, where my students are at and how can I make a change for them. And so I looked back on how do I give them a voice, and how do I make their learning the central part of knowledge building. And so I started this journey with an understanding that I have to take the curriculum and use the curriculum to plant the learning goals. And it was a big change for me because the learning's always been my learning. And I remember thinking back to how do I start a unit, and it was my learning, it was my unit plans, it was my goals, it was my directions, and that was really hard for me. And I look back to where my students were at the beginning of this and where they are now, and how knowledge building has completely taken their learning to a totally new level. In the beginning, I was really overwhelmed, and I didn't really know what I was going to do and how I was going to let this happen in my room. And I guess from my perspective as a classroom teacher, it's now taken a whole new learning for my students. I was really fixed on my ways of teaching, and I knew that it had to be my learning goals and it had to be my plans. But when I took a step back and I realized that knowledge building is, an inquiry-based learning, I thought about how can I make this meaningful for my students? And it's completely opened up a whole new world in how I teach. And yes, in the beginning I was resistant, and I was fearful that am I going to, are students going to learn? Are they going to be engaged? And, am I going to meet the curriculum expectations? And how am I going to assess and evaluate with this new way of learning? And, it was all about what I have to do in the classroom, and taking a step back and knowing that knowledge building honors student voice, and it allows students to be the drivers of their own learning, and it's building their natural curiosity about the world around them. And that was really hard for me in the beginning. I think back to, the greatest barrier was my not wanting to let go, and me not thinking that I could change. And that, if I think back to that greatest barrier of letting go, and if anything that I can say to teachers is that it's okay to let go, and it's okay to be willing to change. And it's not easy, and I agree in the beginning it wasn't easy in figuring out the plans, and how am I going to let this unfold in the classroom, and what assessment practices are going to look differently. But when I think back to the students and their learning goals, that's where it all unfolded, right? And letting them decide on how their learning is going to take place in the class. I look at conferencing with my students, and having conversations with my students, and providing them with opportunities to learn from each other, which has been one of the greatest challenges for me to let go as a classroom teacher, right? We want the control. We want to be the ones who set the goals and the pathways, but my students now set the pathways, and their critical thinking skills and their natural curiosity about, what they're interested in leads them to develop inquiry-based learning in the classroom. I look back to how this all started, and I devised a whole program from my opportunities of taking part in the webinars with my principal and hearing different practitioners that are out in different boards and what are their practices in how they've used knowledge form in their own classroom. And this is a program now that I've created in my classroom where students are using picture learning logs, and they're having discourse with each other in a circle form, and they're sharing and building upon each other's knowledge. And that's huge assessment for me because it's building upon their oral communication. It's helping them to think differently about science concepts in their everyday life, and they're making meaningful and rich connections. And so I really feel that knowledge building is a new way of teaching, and I've said to teachers in my school, it's okay to let go and to give yourself permission to let go, because the reward is greater than anything I've ever experienced.